Hey, deserving listeners. So the patrons asked us to do a deep dive on the story of Josh Powell. And I have done a lot of research. And so first I have a fairly long introduction, Berto, if you'll allow it.
I will stand in your way as much as I can.
Okay. So first off, trigger warning. Throughout this series, we're going to talk about spousal abuse, stalking, sexual abuse, murder, including the murder of small children. There will be long discussions on these topics, and I am also going to provide some of the relevant details about these crimes. So if you have trauma reactivity in these areas, either don't listen, honestly, or talk to your therapist before listening. And also, for everybody, take breaks to check in with yourself as we go. So I want to set the scene because I've been talking with people about what I've been up to lately. People say, oh, what have you been up to? And I was like, oh, I've just been investigating or researching or doing a deep dive on the story of Josh Powell. And I find that a lot of people, even local people, haven't heard of it or they don't remember it. So I want to set the scene. And I'm going to skip to the end of the story. And then once I'm done with that, we'll start from the beginning, just so y'all know where this ends up. So it's February 5th, 2012, Super Bowl Sunday. Just as the game is about to start, it's just after noon, a social worker pulls up to a house in her personal car. She's at work. She's bringing two young boys, age 5 and 7, named Braden and Charlie, respectively. She's bringing them for a supervised visit to their father's house in Graham, Washington, which is about 50 miles south of Seattle, not far from where Berto, you went to high school.
That's right.
The father, Josh Powell, he is required to have a social worker present when he visits with his two boys because the authorities are still investigating whether or not the children are safe to be in his custody. On the previous Wednesday, because it's Sunday on this day, but on the previous Wednesday, some new evidence was presented in court, some very shocking evidence about the father, Josh Powell, evidence that Josh did not like revealed. And so people in the case, including Josh himself, had reasons to believe that this new evidence could result in Josh never seeing his children again. And in a couple days, he's supposed to show up for a very detailed psychosexual evaluation by a court-appointed psychologist. And that psychologist happens to be a friend of mine, a colleague. Even at that time, I knew him, the psychologist. And that psychologist, after the events of this Super Bowl Sunday, he will later reach out to me because he will want to come on this podcast, Psychology in Seattle, to tell his story, I think to clear his name and maybe to clear his conscience. And I'll get into more of that later. But anyway, that psychosexual evaluation that Josh Powell is required to have is going to be a little invasive for Josh Powell, and he knows this, but it's justified. And people involved in the case thought that his evaluation might not only determine his viability as a father, revealing that he isn't safe to have the kids, but also they are wondering and hoping that this psychosexual evaluation will uncover what happened to Josh Powell's wife 3 years prior to this moment. You see, the wife, named Susan, she disappeared off the face of the earth 3 years ago during a blizzard in Utah. Her disappearance immediately became an international news story, and everyone, and I mean everyone, suspected Josh of killing Susan, but the police were never able to charge him. So this test, this psychosexual test, could provide evidence to finally put him behind bars for the murder, the disappearance of his wife, Susan. So a lot of people were interested in the results of this test, not only people in the family, but people around the world, because they were following the story. So that's the state of mind that Josh was in that Super Bowl Sunday. He knew he was possibly going to lose his children for good, and he knew that he might go to prison for the rest of his life, and he knew that the whole world would be watching and would perhaps know what sort of sexual deviancy and I'll get into the actual test later, but it involves a measure of arousal. Let's just put it that way. So the social worker, she walks the two boys up to Josh's house, the father's house. Josh opens the front door, and the boys run inside the house like they reportedly always did on these supervised visits. The social worker is just a couple steps behind the boys, and she is entering the house because she's there to supervise. But Josh pushes her backward, and he slams the door in her face, and he locks the door. The social worker is stunned at first, naturally. This has probably never happened to her before. This is what she does for a living. But then when she realizes what's happening, she starts ringing the doorbell. She starts pounding on the door, telling Josh to open the door. And eventually she hears from behind the door, she can hear Josh saying, "Charlie, I have a big surprise for you." Then she smells gasoline, and a lot of gasoline. And she knows that Josh is capable of terrible things, allegedly, because the thought was that he had killed his wife 3 years earlier. So she runs back to her car and calls 911. Frantically, she tells the 911 operator about the situation, and she tells him, the 911 operator, that he needs to send the police and emergency services immediately. But the 911 operator seems like he just woke up from a nap. At times, the 911 operator seemed like he just wasn't really listening. At other times, he seemed skeptical about her claim that it was an emergency. And other times, he seemed completely dismissive of her. So after a few minutes of being brushed off by him, she looks up and sees the house erupt in flames. And not just a small fire, but the entire house is suddenly ablaze. So this clip is from KOIN 6 TV.
Now check out this video. You can see roaring flames, thick smoke and ash coming from the home of Josh Powell. Police say when the children got close to the door, Powell dragged them inside and locked the caseworker out. Moments later, a fiery blast leveled the house. It happened just days after Powell was denied custody of his boys by a Washington judge who ruled they should remain with their grandparents. Police say Powell was a person of interest in the case of his missing wife. Susan Powell hasn't been seen since December of 2009.
So, thoughts on this so far, Berto?
Man, when this story came out, you watch these horrific movies sometimes where, horrific things happen in them, and you're glad that it's just a movie. But this stuff being real life really darkens the universe. It's such a vivid, in my mind, such a vivid moment, because I can picture it. I can picture those two little boys running in excitement to see their father, and that moment of terror for the social worker, the helplessness of, first trying to do something, being thwarted for even trying, but then seeing the flames, like, what can you say? It's horrible.
So later, after the firefighters put out the fire, the investigators conclude that Josh had struck the boys in the head multiple times with an axe, and then he lit the gasoline, killing himself along with the two boys, Braden and Charlie. And then later, medical examiners determined that the boys ultimately died from smoke inhalation, not from the multiple axe injuries. So apparently the axe injuries didn't kill the boys, and they died from the fire ultimately. And of course, there was always this question as to whether or not Josh had murdered his wife 3 years prior, but after he killed his two children in such a brutal way, no one had any doubt as to what had happened to Susan. They just didn't know the exact details of it. So all this raises the question, why did Josh do this? And why do so many people do things like this? Why have we heard stories like this of so-called family annihilators, this kind of thing. And also, how could he do this? How could anyone do this? So in this deep dive series, I want to answer those questions. I want to, at least try to answer them, along with a lot of other questions like, what is Josh's diagnosis? Was he narcissistic, psychopathic, antisocial, something else? And because my friend and colleague evaluated him, we can actually get at that answer. Also, what about the father, Stephen? I haven't even mentioned him. That's a whole other part of the story. What was going on with him? How can we detect these traits in the people around us so we can steer clear of them, right? And maybe help our loved ones steer clear. What could Susan have done, maybe, to protect herself? What could the government have done in Washington State to protect the children? Did the police in Utah screw up the case? Because there's a lot of allegations about that. Did my friend and colleague, Dr. Jim Manley, did he screw up the case? And also, if Josh murdered Susan, how? Because there's a lot of theories out there, and I'll provide mine, and Berto, you can provide yours. So in this deep dive series, I want to get at all of these questions, but in order to do that, we need to go through the full story, because the devil's in the details, so to speak, and there are many, many details to this story. I had already done a deep dive on the story years ago, but in preparation for these episodes, for this deep dive, I went even deeper. There's a lot of details. And we have an inordinate amount of details because almost everyone involved in the story kept detailed diaries, written diaries, audio diaries, video diaries. Josh Powell himself kept a detailed diary for years. Susan wrote in a diary, and she frequently emailed her friends personal stories and her feelings. So we have all those emails, we have all those journals, we have Josh's full journal, we have Susan's full journal, we have Stephen, the father, his, and that's a whole other story that we'll get into. Also, like I said, my friend Dr. Jim Manley, he conducted a full psychological evaluation of Josh. So there's just so much data. And also, a lot of investigators and journalists have interviewed a lot of witnesses and people close, so that there's all that data. And I've reviewed much of that data, and I have distilled it down to its most relevant details. And that's what I'm going to present to you, Berto, and then we will discuss as we go. What do you say?
Sounds like a lot. I hope my brain doesn't fry.
Yeah. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist, and I'm also a professor.
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I train... Do you know what fireflies are?
Mm-hmm.
So you know how they're crunchy on the outside?
Mm-hmm.
That's my doing.
Ah. So, Berto, well, first off, did you hear about the Susan disappearance?
No.
Okay.
When this happened, I had not heard... I've talked about this before on the podcast. When O.J. Simpson was first being chased, it was a famous moment in our history where we're watching live on TV this person being chased on the freeway, in a white Bronco for allegedly murdering two people. And I remember when I was watching that, I was going...
to be clear, he wasn't...
It wasn't like a high-speed chase, but it was,
He was, from my memory, going to be questioned by the police.
Right. Actually, they weren't trying to arrest him. They were just trying to talk to him.
They were just trying to talk to him because his
he was
ex-wife...
fleeing, hiding in the backseat of the Bronco.
He jumped into a car with his friend. His friend's driving, and he has a gun. Right. And they get on the phone with 911.
Right.
And he's saying, I'm going to kill myself because I don't see a reason to go on living.
Right. So for me, when I watched that, because I remember, and I was younger and even more naive, I remember watching that, and I had such a little understanding of how the justice system works that in my mind, I just assumed, oh, okay, well, they've got him dead to rights. Like, he obviously did it because, it's obvious. And I guess they'll just catch him and send him to jail. That's what I figured. Little did I know, it was going to be like the trial of the century, and ultimately he'd walk. Like, that was so mind-blowing. So similarly, when this story was breaking, And they were saying, oh, and mysteriously his wife disappeared. And
So the story of the fire.
the fire, the fire. I'm hearing the fire, and it's like this horrific situation. And I'm sitting there at the time. I remember kind of really embodying the moment and feeling the horror that those last moments must have been the ultimate horror, like of confusion and
I don't want to just get into the gory details just for the sake of getting into the gory details, but I think it's important because if we're going to analyze Josh Powell's psychology, then we have to look at some of these details. And the detail that just I cannot get out of my head is that, and I have just really icky feeling inside my body right now that he has an axe. He knows he's going to kill his boys. And he axes one of the boys.
One of them, I know.
And the other boy is watching and sees it happening and is watching his father just brutally, multiple injuries, right? Because it probably took a while for the child to be unconscious or subdued enough or something. And then the father turns to the boy that's witnessing this, grabs him, right? So you just imagine, and thinks, oh, I'm next.
Yeah.
I mean,
and not comprehending what they're seeing, why they're seeing what they're seeing. You almost must go into a fugue state of like, I had a near-death experience in a car crash, and everything slowed down right before we hit a tree. Like, time really slowed down. It was bizarre. I saw everything going in slow motion. So I'm almost imagining, like, kind of going into a weird delusion. Like, am I even awake? Is this even real? Like,
yeah.
So when all this was developing and they were reporting on the news, and then it came out, like, well, his wife had gone mysteriously missing. I felt such rage in that moment. And of course, I didn't have all the details, but that the quote unquote trauma from the OJ thing came back because it was like, wait, what? It was like this anger of how could this have happened? Like, how can someone's wife go mysteriously missing and then
and you were probably told the broad strokes of the disappearance, which was that she disappeared one night, and his alibi is that during one of the biggest blizzards that's ever happened in Utah, and Utah knows blizzards, knows snow, right? He takes his two young boys, 1 and 4 years of age, for a camping trip after midnight. He gets in his minivan.
It's what people do.
And then he came back and she was mysteriously gone. Yeah. And they'd been fighting all this time, and she had said to multiple people, including her own journals, if I end up dead, Josh probably killed me. So
at the time, I only knew a little bit of these things, but even the little I heard just in the news, I was in such a rage of, like, how is this possible? Like, how can people not connect the dots? How can this man be free? How can this have happened? And then sadly, the more that came out over the subsequent weeks, it didn't help. It just made things worse.
Yeah. So we're going to get into that. The police, the DSHS, child services, social services in Washington State. I've got a lot to say about it. So we're going to get into that. But first, Berto, let's take a break. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right, we're back from the break. So for me, I don't remember the story of Susan Powell's disappearance, even though it was a very popular news story going around at the time. But I didn't really pay attention to the news back then. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have cable TV, so I just probably didn't know about it. But I do remember hearing the story of the murder-suicide and the fire, because it was local and it was so sensational. And
what year was this?
2012.
And then the wife disappeared
2009.
2009.
Yeah. And I learned the details of the story because when Dr. James Manley asked to come on the podcast, I basically used that as an opportunity to learn about the details.
Yeah.
And so I learned about it then. And by the way, Berto, on Wikipedia, the page for Susan Powell and Josh Powell and the kids, they reference the podcast.
Oh my gosh, infamy!
It's one of the those little numbers that you click on.
Is that like the doctor appeared on a podcast? Blah blah blah.
Yeah, I also wrote a paper about the whole thing and had it on my website, but it's no longer there. But the Wayback Machine still has it apparently, and so I got to see that. Okay, so I want to tell everyone where I got all my information from, because I mostly just want to praise some main sources. The main source of the information is from the Cold podcast, hosted by journalist Dave Cawley. He did an amazing job on this podcast. It's a rare podcast in that it's like classic journalism, where he investigates, he asks questions, he presents firsthand sources. He doesn't speculate. He doesn't talk about his own experience. He doesn't even really talk about his own emotional experience. I mean, that style of podcast is certainly great. Like we're doing it here.
Right.
But classic journalism, I feel, is on the wane. It's waning, right?
Yeah, right.
And I listened to it years ago, but I listened to it all over again. And I also didn't realize just how much story he actually discovered, because he interviewed so many different people.
Oh, wow.
And he interviewed police, and he interviewed family members. He interviewed Dr. Manley. And it's just a great podcast, the Cold podcast. I also found a lot of information on YouTube and on the internet, other news outlets, but it's just a lot of different sources, So that is where most of my information comes from. Okay, so the format of this series is going to be chronological, instead of the typical format of providing data in the order that it was discovered by the police. That's usually what happens, right? It'll just be like the surface level information, and then they'll reveal more information as they go. I just want to go chronological because it is easier for me to do that. And also I want to provide an analysis as we go. And I think if I do it the typical way of providing like frequent flashbacks, it'll get confusing. So that's what I'm going to do. So let's start from the very beginning. We have Josh Powell, born 1976 in Puyallup, which is near Seattle. And the town Puyallup is infamous as being a litmus test for locals, because if you can pronounce it, then you're a local. And if sort of like Tukwila, or if you call, Pike Place Market, Pike's Place Market or something. But Puyallup, if you look it up, it doesn't look like the way it's pronounced. Or Geoduck, for example. So Josh Powell, born 1976 in Puyallup, in a Mormon family. His parents, Stephen and Teresa. Teresa's name is spelled Terrica. Terika.
I've never heard of that.
Stephen and Teresa were married in a Mormon temple, meaning that they were very Mormon, because to be married in a temple means that you jump through a lot of hoops.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Oh, you didn't know that?
No, I just assumed that was like what you do if you're Mormon.
No.
Like when you're Catholic, you don't have to jump to too many hoops.
Well, I imagine there's some.
Yeah, actually, I mean, sure, but it's expected. Like, if you're Catholic, you're getting married at a Catholic church.
Yeah, I mean, unless you're like a known problem in the church. But in the Mormon religion, there's a lot of things you have to do, and I think it's fairly easy for the elders of the church to say, no, you aren't worthy for whatever reason.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I'm speaking as a person who has heard a lot of Mormon people describe this to me, so I can't speak from first hand.
I got married in an Episcopalian church, and the only prerequisite, because I wasn't a member of that church, but I did have to go to counseling with the priest.
Right.
We did, and he advised us not to get married.
Oh, really?
Yes.
You and your wife?
Yeah.
What? Why?
Oh, the usual. He said, listen, you're Latin, and I mean, you know what that means. So, like, it's probably not a good idea.
You've told me this before.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
So this is a minister in Tacoma.
Yeah.
Near near where they got married. Did he say anything more than that, or was he just?
I feel like the combination of implications was that I would potentially beat my wife and or cheat or both.
Oh my God!
I'm not entirely sure because we were very young and
Was
we
it
were
her
in
church?
shock.
Was it her church?
It was no, it wasn't. It was.
But it wasn't your church.
It was my mom's church.
Oh,
At that time, it's no longer her church, but yeah.
wow.
It was very bizarre. And I was too young to like, I was so upset, but I was too young to
did you say anything in the meetings that were along those lines?
No, I mean, I wasn't like, well, I'm Latin. Ella sabe que viene.
No.
Like,
But did you tell stories about how, because you guys were young, and there's conflict. And,
well, I'm sure that he probably was picking up that, we were young and we did not necessarily see eye to eye on a lot of things. So fine. So say like, I noticed a lot of tension. Are you guys sure you're ready? Stuff like this. But like, I mean, you're Latin. You know what that means. Like, what?
So he refused to marry you?
No, he married us.
Oh.
But begrudgingly.
How great is that your minister, like, begrudgingly.
Yeah.
I'll
do it. I mean, I'll do it.
But he's Latin.
I'll do it. I mean, I'm not going to do it in Spanish if that's what you think.
Wow. Yeah. Also, to get married in the Mormon temple, the guests have to be worthy to enter the temple as well. And it's common that the people you invite can't actually attend the wedding because they're like if if we had friends that were getting married in temple, we would not be able to attend the wedding. But or if you are a Mormon but you've been kind of off and on.
I see.
So
point is that they were definitely in. They were in the
and that's relevant, for later. And I'm only 85% sure of everything I'm saying about the Mormon church. There were 5 children eventually. Jennifer, the oldest, I think, and then Josh was the second, and then John, Michael, and Alina was the youngest. Jennifer, as an adult, she's the oldest. She was the only child to distance herself from Stephen and Josh. And later, as an adult, during the police investigation, Jennifer was the only family member who worked really hard to figure out what happened to Susan and to protect the children. For example, she wore a wire on her own behalf. Okay. She was just like, I'm going to get Josh to confess.
Wait, this wasn't in conjunction with the police? Like, it was just...
She told the police, but the police were like, well, we can't stop you, but I don't know if we recommend it. And she's like, I'm going to do it. So she wears a wire, and I've listened to that whole tape, which is interesting. So Jennifer worked really hard to get justice for Susan and to protect the children. And, in the end, it didn't work. So with Josh being the second, and then we have John, Jennifer would later say that as an adult, John suffered from bipolar and schizophrenia. There's also a lot of reports of him exhibiting very disturbing behavior, which we'll get into later. Do you remember anything about John?
So he's younger, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't.
When we started this deep dive process, researching it, at some point I told you to stop researching it because I wanted to reveal details to you. This is one of those details, which we'll get to later.
Okay.
Michael, as an adult, he was very close to Josh. More on him later as well. He might have been. There are theories that he was involved in the disposal of Susan's body. Alina, the youngest, as an adult, she was a very adamant defender of Stephen through everything. Alina. So we'll get into that more later. And I think that family lived in the Spokane area for most of Josh's childhood, but I couldn't find confirmation of that. Okay, so that's Josh, his family. Then we have Susan Cox, his eventual wife. She's born 1981 in New Mexico, also to a Mormon family. Seemingly, Susan was raised well enough. However, Susan seems to have some issues later in life. We'll get into all this later, but she could be assertive, but she could also be dismissive of her own needs and would allow Josh to trample her needs at times, and she didn't seem to push back enough. She also seemed to have an obsession with having children regardless of the circumstances. More on that later. She enters the story later. So that's Josh and Susan. But now let's get to Stephen, because the father needs to be discussed here. So his parenting obviously is a relevant detail here, because that can shed some light on Josh's personality and his behavior. So Susan Powell, reportedly, he vacillated between being too passive and too punitive. So the too passive part was that he didn't enforce limits on his son's behaviors in particular. On his daughters, he was less passive, less permissive. But with his sons, it was like he just didn't care if his boys did whatever they wanted to do. And it almost seemed like he encouraged the bad behavior at times, particularly if it bothered his wife, the boy's mom. But then at times he would explode and become too punitive. He would suddenly get angry at the children for bad behavior, even though normally he had zero limits. The mother said he was, quote, far more violent than was necessary or fair. Far more violent, so he was violent.
That's a creepy phrase when you're talking about parenting, right?
Yeah.
Because it's bad enough to be like, yeah, he was a football player and he was far more violent than he needed to be. But when you're talking about, like, he was a parent of young children and he's far more violent, like...
Right, I didn't think about that, because that implies, the full phrase, far more violent than was necessary. Well,
some amount of violence
is necessary.
Because usually you couch it, you don't even call it violence. Usually, especially when we were growing up, it might be like, well, a little bit of physical punishment goes a long way.
Right.
This isn't even called physical punishment. This is violence.
Yeah.
And this is far more violent, than is necessary.
Right. So even if he was only violent in the fair and necessary way, we might still, as outside observers, say the mom's bar is set too problematically, wherever that is.
And it wasn't more violent, it was far.
Yeah. For example, he would yell and he would scream at the children, in addition to being violent. He would call them names and he would hit them. And he was particularly abusive with Josh, Teresa reported. Quote, for years, Steve pointedly attacked Josh very frequently, nearly every day for a time. Nearly every day.
I wonder how common this is. I saw some of these dynamics in my family, not like in my direct family, but like cousins and things like that, where the oldest male seemed to get, the harshest treatment. And I mean, it makes some intuitive sense. It's like, okay, well, he's not the baby anymore, and he's a guy. He can take it, So, I wonder if that's like a common pattern where at least
not particularly. I mean, it's tempting to draw those kinds of generalizations, but it's across the board. There's a lot of different possibilities as to why one person, whether it's related to gender or their personality or the circumstances around their birth or whatever. There's just various reasons why a child would be targeted in that way. But anyway, so for whatever reason, Josh was targeted. And I'm just trying to think, given everything that's in my head, is if I have any kind of speculation as to why Stephen would particularly attack Josh. The only very loose speculation I would have is that Stephen, his childhood, of which I know nothing about, which I wish I did, but it was never reported on in all the stuff I was looking at. But Stephen's childhood might have had something along these lines of being abused, and maybe he was the oldest boy, or he was targeted in particular, or his older brother was some kind of recreation is my guess. I don't know. Also, another factor can be that when you have young parents, they tend to lack in skill to the greatest degree.
Yeah.
As parents get older, they learn things. And so the later children can sometimes experience less problems.
That's kind of what I was saying, is because like your first kids, first of all, it's the most stressful. You don't know what you're doing. So you might also resent them without knowing more. But of course, this sounds like egregious way beyond that. Because what I'm describing is sort of like maybe normal parental situations. But this sounds way worse.
Yeah, it could also be that Josh actually put himself in the line of fire some older kids will sacrifice themselves. I didn't hear anything along those lines, and he certainly didn't exhibit any. Well, maybe he did. Anyway, hard to know, but he did target Josh in particular. And when Josh was a teenager, Stephen wrote this in his diary. Quote, "At times, I have no idea how to handle Josh. He is very independent, and he is a little taller than me now, and he may be a little stronger and bulkier than me. Spanking didn't even help when he was younger."
That's an interesting transition. It's funny. This happened to me with my dad when I think I was maybe 14 or 15. I was starting to be close to him in height, and at the time I was like doing lots of pull-ups and everything. And I wouldn't say I was stronger than him yet, but I was certainly no longer a little boy. And one time he was very upset at me about something. I was being a complete brat, and for the first time ever, he punched my arm. Like, he had never laid hands on me, but he was so upset he like punched my arm. I don't know if he wasn't trying, but I was in Taekwondo at the time, so I got punched every Saturday and Sunday for 2 hours straight. So I was just like, eh. And it just frustrated him so much. And of course, I was being a complete jerk. But looking back on it, and now me being a father, I'm like, yeah, that's got to be an interesting transition when you're able to tell your kids, go to your room, do whatever, and then when you're much bigger and older and your voice is deeper, there's kind of an implicit like, oh yeah, dad's saying blah. But all of a sudden, your boy or girl might be bigger, more athletic, more whatever. And in a culture where physical imposition was, and still is in many cases, a factor, that would be a weird transition. And then if you're a parent who actually thinks of physical punishment as a tool, and that tool is basically like eroding, then you'd be like, well, now what do I do?
Right. That's the key here.
Yeah.
Is it's not likely that you, with your two daughters, you're going to have thoughts like this.
Of course not.
Like, oh, she's big now. She could maybe kick my ass.
Right.
Maybe I should think about how I'm parenting the kid. What?
Right.
If you're in this mindset of, I am now unable to bank on the fact that I can physically harm this person, this child, and not fear retribution or defending themselves. Like, that mindset says something that he wrote it in his journal. It also kind of is in the vein that we'll get to later of envy that he has regarding his narcissism. So that's his parenting, but there's more details to his parenting. But first, let's take a break. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
All right, we're back from the break. So going on with more details about Stephen and his parenting was that he had quote-unquote bad boundaries. For example, he talked about adult concerns in front of his young children. He would later do this with Josh and Susan's kids, Braden and Charlie, the ones who were murdered by Josh. And we have that on audio recordings because eventually there was a wire. And he would and Josh would do this as well. There's just open there didn't seem to be any concern about editing one's topics or words in front of the children. And Stephen did that with all of his kids. And I want to ask you, Berto, like, how do you manage this with your daughters regarding, like, you'll have an impulse to maybe turn to your wife and say, oh, we need to talk about this thing that happened. How do you figure out what and what not to say?
In the context of them doing something wrong?
No, like something happens at work or you're worried about your health or something.
Oh, I see. And when not to include the kids in those conversations.
Yeah, and the kids are there.
Oh, dude, no, actually, I have been not good at that stuff. I've had to learn to be better, and I'm still not good. Basically, I've definitely incurred cases where, or I've done cases where I was talking, for example, about my health, and then my daughter ends up being super worried and probably a bit traumatized from the conversation. And it wasn't, in my mind, it was just like me just sharing my worries and like, oh gosh, I'm going to go to the doctor, blah, blah.
Yeah, I remember this, just the details I remember is you were telling me about how your house was under renovation.
Right.
The flooring was being changed, the wood flooring, and there was all this glue and material around, and you were concerned that the inhalants, the particulates and the chemicals were causing problems with your breathing and your lungs, and it was scary to you, and you were
talking about it
freely in front of the children, and then like a day later you hear one of your daughters just completely anxious about something that they weren't anxious about before.
Yeah, and so I've been guilty of that, and it's not only with health. There's definitely been times where basically where the right approach is you as adults go discuss it, and then maybe actually have a version of the conversation with the kids. That's like, now what we have done, which is positive, is there.
I mean, is that partially due because your dad wasn't very good at that? Like you didn't have good models about.
Certainly, I'm imagining that's a lot.
Because for me, my parents never talked about adult stuff and like ever.
Right. Whereas in my house in Colombia, I was the one separating my dad and my grandma often because they were yelling, and it was quite dramatic. Yeah.
Does your wife have a gauge around that as well?
Yes, except she's got the opposite damage because she had this whole thing in her household where her dad would get super angry and do the silent treatment on her mom for days.
Oh.
And then her mom would just be quiet and not bring things up. Like all these kind of like opposite
So she
problems.
probably kind of likes hearing communication. You're saying it's the opposite, meaning there was a problem, but no one was acknowledging it or saying anything about it.
And then also I have found that especially when the kids were younger, that at times my feeling, and I could be wrong, was that she was a little too protective of the kids, you know. But in either case, one thing that we have learned to do well, I think, is whenever we've had like an argument about something, we make sure the kids hear us kind of discussing our way out of it and like reaching a resolution.
Yeah.
Which is something I never heard.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah.
Isn't that weird?
No.
I mean,
I think it's almost universal.
Fair enough. It's just that, but I guess what I mean by weird is I have countless memories of arguments and problems and things. I don't have one memory of like, oh, but there was that one day where like they shook hands and things were nice.
Yeah. Yeah. Or someone apologized.
Or someone apologized.
Took responsibility. Or
someone said, I see it from your side. Nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's common.
Yeah.
So apparently Stephen had, and I would say way worse boundaries than what you're talking about, because not only did he lack that editor in his mind, but he also would talk about a lot of really what we might call toxic things, which we'll get into later. Oof. He also shared pornography with his 3 sons. Did you know this detail?
Yeah, I do remember something about the pornography, yes.
So I want to get into this in detail, but first, Berto, let's take a break. And after the break is just going to be for patrons of the podcast.
Oh.
We're going to do a deep dive on early exposure to pornography. And it's pretty complicated. I'm going to tell stories from my own life. I'm going to tell stories, clinical stories as well. And I'm going to talk about the research because it's a lot more nuanced than is typically talked about. But to hear the rest of this episode and the end of every one of these episodes in this series is going to be for patrons because they were the ones that were asking for this, and they're the ones that fund this whole operation. So become a patron and you can hear this. Otherwise, please take care of yourself because
you deserve it.